My son-in-law handed me a printed document the first time I asked to take my granddaughter to the park alone. I was standing in the hallway of their house in Plano, holding a little pink backpack I'd bought her, and he slid 2 pages across the kitchen island like we were closing a real estate deal. I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I looked up at him and said, "Is this a joke?" It was not a joke. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 58 years old. I spent 27 years as a structural inspector for the city of Fort Worth. Retired early when my wife Carol got sick and have been living alone in the same house in Weatherford since she passed. Carol died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from the first symptom to the last morning. She was the kind of woman who kept a handwritten list of every book she'd ever read going back to college, who made her mother's peach cobbler from memory every 4th of July, who once sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours with a neighbor she barely knew just so the woman wouldn't be alone. She loved our daughter Sophie fiercely and without conditions. She adored our granddaughter Lily from the moment she was born. Used to hold her in the rocking chair by the window and sing old Patsy Cline songs just slightly off-key and completely unashamed about it. Lily used to fall asleep in about 4 minutes flat. After Carol died, I thought the hardest part would be learning to cook for one person. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing that the family I thought I had was being slowly reorganized around me. One policy at a time. It didn't happen all at once. My son-in-law Brandon had always been particular. That's the word I used in my head for years. Particular. He had opinions about how things should run, how the house should be kept, how visitors should behave, how long they should stay. Sophie had always been easygoing, the kind of person who laughs at most things and doesn't carry grudges. And in the early years of their marriage, I assumed she balanced him out. What I didn't see was that over time, easygoing had quietly become accommodating, and accommodating had become something closer to managed. Lily was 4 when Carol passed. She's 6 now. For the first year after, I drove the 45 minutes to Plano every Sunday. I'd call ahead, always. I'd bring Lily something small, a library book, a box of sidewalk chalk, a packet of stickers she could put on her notebooks. I'd stay 3 hours, sometimes 4 if it seemed welcome. I'd help with whatever needed doing around the house. I wasn't trying to insert myself. I was trying to stay connected. That's all I was doing. The restrictions came in gradually. First it was don't park in front of the house because it blocked Brandon's view of the driveway. Then it was please call by Thursday if I wanted to come Sunday because they needed time to plan. Then it was no bringing food because Lily had some sensitivities Brandon wanted managed carefully. Then one Sunday I showed up and Brandon answered the door and told me Sophie had a headache and it wasn't a good time. I drove an hour-and-a-half round trip to hear that through a half-open door. I mentioned it to Sophie later that week. She said Brandon just wanted things to be predictable. She said he had a lot going on with work. She said, "You know how he is, Dad." I did know how he was. What I was starting to understand was that Sophie had stopped questioning whether the way things were was the way things should be. The document arrived on a Tuesday morning about 6 months after the headache Sunday. Brandon emailed it to me. No phone call first. No explanation. Just a PDF attached to a message that said, "Going forward, we'd like to have some structure around visits. Please review." I printed it and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and read it twice. Visits to be scheduled a minimum of 7 days in advance. Maximum duration of 3 hours. No unplanned outings with Lily without 72 hours written notice. No gifts valued over $25 without prior approval. No discussing financial matters with Sophie. No posting photos of Lily on any social media platform. And at the bottom, a section titled Family Support Contribution that said, in plain language, that in order to maintain regular and consistent access to Lily, I was expected to contribute $400 per month to a household account that Brandon would manage. It was framed as helping cover the logistical costs of coordinated family visits. I set the paper down. I picked up my coffee. I looked out the window at the bird feeder Carol had put up the spring before she got sick, the one I still fill every few days because I can't bring myself to take it down. I called Sophie that afternoon. She answered on the 3rd ring and she sounded tired. I asked her if she'd seen the email Brandon had sent me. She was quiet for a moment and then she said yes. I asked her if she agreed with it. She said they'd talked about it and she thought it made sense for everyone to be on the same page. I asked her about the $400. She said it was just a way to make things feel more equal, that they had a lot of expenses with Lily in school now, that it wasn't meant to be offensive. I said I understood. I said I needed a few days to think. She said that was fine. I did not think for a few days. I thought for about 40 minutes, sitting in Carol's chair in the living room with the television off. Then I picked up my phone and called a friend of mine from the city inspector's office, a woman named Ruth, who had gone through a custody situation with her own grandchildren after her son's divorce a few years back. She'd mentioned a family attorney in Fort Worth named James Whitfield. She said he was methodical, didn't make promises he couldn't keep, and didn't charge you for drama. I asked her if she still had his number. She texted it to me before we even got off the phone. I called James Whitfield's office the next morning. His paralegal put me through within the hour, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I'm not a man who uses a lot of extra words. I gave him the facts in order. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Mr. Mercer, I want you to do a few things before we speak again. Save that email and print the PDF. Write down every visit that was shortened, canceled, or refused, with dates and what you were told. And I want you to pull together any financial records you have related to money you've given your daughter and son-in-law. Everything. Transfers, checks, anything you can document." I asked him why the finances mattered. He said that in Texas, money given as a gift within a marriage can sometimes complicate things depending on how it was used and whether it was documented. He said he wanted a complete picture. I had given Sophie and Brandon money twice. The first time was 3 years ago when they were getting ready to buy their house in Plano. I gave them $22,000 as a down payment gift. It was money I had been saving since Sophie was in middle school. A college fund she ended up not needing because she got a partial scholarship and worked her way through the rest. I told her the money was hers, and I gave it to them without any paperwork because they were family, and it didn't occur to me to think I needed any. The second time was 14 months ago, about 8 months after Carol passed. Brandon had been talking about starting a landscaping business on the side. Said he had a client lined up and just needed equipment to get started. Sophie called me and asked if I could help. I wired them $11,000. I wrote business loan in the memo line out of habit. I never drew up anything formal. My accountant, a man named Gerald Okafor who has done my taxes for 16 years and who keeps files so organized it makes my head hurt in a good way, pulled both transactions within a day of me calling him. The $22,000 to the down payment account was clean. The $11,000 was something else. Gerald showed me a bank statement I hadn't seen before, one he'd found in the folder with my wire transfer confirmation, that showed the $11,000 had cleared into their joint account, and within 3 weeks, $8,300 of it had been transferred to a separate account in Brandon's name only. The landscaping business had never materialized. Sophie had mentioned it to me once in passing about 6 months later, and I'd assumed it just hadn't worked out. I hadn't thought much about it. I sat in Gerald's office for a long time after he walked me through it. I thought about Brandon at that kitchen island, sliding that PDF across to me like it was a standard form, like there was nothing unusual about charging a grandfather $400 a month to sit in a living room and watch his granddaughter do puzzles. I thought about Sophie sounding tired on the phone, saying it just made sense for everyone to be on the same page. I thought about the $11,000 in the landscaping business that never happened, and I wondered how long the account in Brandon's name had been there, and whether Sophie knew about it, and if she didn't, what else she didn't know. I didn't call Sophie. I didn't call Brandon. I kept my next 2 Sunday visits exactly as they had been, called 7 days ahead, arrived on time, stayed 3 hours, parked on the street. I sat on their gray sectional and watched Lily color in her activity book and told her about the deer I'd seen near the creek behind my house. She told me she wanted to see a real deer more than almost anything. I told her we'd figure that out someday. Brandon sat in the kitchen the whole time with his laptop. Sophie made small talk. It was cordial in the way that things are when everyone is being very careful. James and Gerald worked together over the following 5 weeks. I did not say a word to either of them about it. What James put together was a formal demand letter outlining the $11,000 as a documented loan, given the memo notation on the original transfer, and requesting repayment in full. The letter also noted the pattern of restricted access to Lily and referenced Texas Family Code Section 153.333, which allows grandparents to petition the court for access when that access is being withheld in a manner that would significantly impair the child's physical health or emotional well-being. The letter was calm. It was specific. It was not angry, not accusatory. It simply laid out facts and what I was prepared to do with them. Gerald prepared a financial summary, the wire transfer confirmation with the memo notation, the $11,000 hitting their joint account, the $8,300 moving to Brandon's separate account 18 days later. Dates, amounts, account numbers were visible. A clear, documented picture. I put both documents in a manila envelope. I sealed it. I put it on the passenger seat of my truck on a Saturday morning and drove to Plano. Sophie answered the door. She was in a good mood, or doing a good job of seeming like she was. She said Lily was in the backyard and asked if I wanted coffee. I said I had something I needed to give to Brandon first. Her expression shifted slightly just at the edges. She called him. Brandon came to the door with his laptop tucked under his arm, that look on his face like he was doing me a favor by appearing. I held out the envelope. He looked at it. He looked at me. He took it. He opened it there in the doorway, with Sophie standing just behind his shoulder. He pulled out the first page and started reading. I watched his expression. It didn't go to guilt first, it went to confusion. The kind of confusion that happens when you've built a version of something in your head and someone just handed you a document that uses a completely different set of numbers. He read the second page. He read the second page. He read the financial summary. He set the papers down at his side and looked up at me and said, "What is this?" "It's a letter from my attorney," I said, "and a financial summary from my accountant. There's also a section at the end about grandparent access rights under Texas law." I'd read that part carefully too. Sophie looked at the papers in his hand. She said, "Brandon, what does it say?" He didn't answer her right away. I watched something move across his face that I recognized. It was the calculation of a man trying to decide how to spin something before the other person reads it themselves. Sophie stepped around him and took the papers from his hand and started reading. Brandon said, "It's nothing. He's just." "It's not nothing," I said quietly. "The account is documented, Brandon. The transfer dates are documented. The memo notation on the original wire is documented. All of it." Sophie stopped reading. She looked up at me and then at him. She said, "What account?" That was the question. I'd wondered for 5 weeks whether she knew, and I had decided sitting in Gerald's office that she probably didn't. Watching her face in that doorway, I knew I was right. She didn't know. That made it worse for him and better for her, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I'd been holding without realizing it for a long time. I want to be clear about something. I was not angry standing there. I had been angry in the first days after reading that PDF. Before I made any calls, I'd sat in Carol's chair with that particular kind of anger that doesn't make any noise, the kind that just sits in your rib cage and presses, but by the time I was standing in that doorway on a Saturday morning with lilies somewhere in the backyard, I was past angry. I was clear. There is a difference. Angry makes mistakes. Clear just says the thing that needs to be said. I'm not here to blow anything up, I told them both. I'm here because Sophie deserves to know what's been happening, and because I deserve to see my granddaughter without paying for the privilege. Lily appeared at that moment at the end of the hallway, having come in through the back door with dirt on her knees and a dandelion in each hand. She held them up when she saw me. "Grandpa Danny, I picked you flowers," she said. "Those are excellent flowers," I said. She ran over and tucked them both into my shirt pocket. Sophie was looking at Brandon. He was looking at the ground. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Sophie said, "Come in, Dad," in the voice she uses when she has made a decision and is done negotiating about it. We sat at their kitchen table for close to 3 hours. Lily went back outside because the grown-ups were talking about boring stuff, which is exactly what we told her, and I watched her through the window chasing something in the backyard, a bird or a butterfly. I couldn't tell which. Brandon at first tried to explain the transfer as an investment account he'd set up for Lily's future, something he'd meant to tell Sophie about, something that had gotten complicated with a business contact. The story changed twice. At a certain point, Sophie put her hand flat on the table and said his name once, and the story stopped changing, and Brandon just sat there. I don't want to characterize their marriage for them. That's their territory. What I can tell you is that Sophie called me 4 days later from her mother's old phone number. the one I still have saved in my contacts, and she sounded different from the tired way she'd sounded for the past 2 years. She said she'd gotten a lawyer. She said she was going to be okay. She said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know how much of it was happening." I told her she didn't need to apologize to me. She said she did. We went back and forth on it for a minute, and I let her win, because sometimes that's what you do. 6 months later, Sophie and Lily were living in an apartment in Keller, about 20 minutes from my house. I pick Lily up every Saturday morning and we drive out to the creek trail near Weatherford, where Carol used to walk. The herons nest out there in the spring, and I showed Lily one last month, standing completely still in the shallows about 15 feet off the trail, and she grabbed my hand and whispered, "Is it a real one?" Like she thought it might be mechanical. I told her yes, it was very real. She stared at it for about 4 full minutes without making a sound, which is the longest she's been still in her entire life as far as I can tell. She calls herons the standing birds now. I told her the proper name. She looked at me very seriously and said, "I know, Grandpa Danny, but standing birds is better." I didn't argue. She's right. Brandon and Sophie's divorce is working its way through the courts. The $11,000 was addressed as part of the financial discovery process. James told me not to expect full recovery on the undocumented portion, and I told him I'd already made my peace with that. Some things cost what they cost. What I got back was more than money. If you are watching this and something in it sounds familiar, I want to say a few things directly. What happened to me has a name. It's called financial coercion, and it's more common than people talk about, especially in situations where one person in a marriage has slowly positioned themselves as the gatekeeper to family relationships. The way it works is gradual. You give someone the impression that access to the people you love is contingent on your compliance. The love inside a family can be regulated and invoiced, and the person on the other end of that, if they're the kind of person who doesn't make scenes, who trusts the people around them, who keeps hoping things will smooth out on their own, that person will absorb a remarkable amount before they understand what they're being subjected to. I'm not a confrontational man. I spent my career checking structures, making sure the things people depended on were sound. I don't move fast. I don't escalate without reason. But there is a real difference between keeping the peace and accepting terms that were designed to drain you. I learned to tell them apart. Grandparents have legal standing in Texas. Under the Texas Family Code, a grandparent can petition the court for access to a grandchild when that access is being unreasonably denied, and when denial would significantly impair the child's well-being. I did not know that before I called James Whitfield. I'm telling you now, because maybe you don't know it either. Document your money. I know it feels cold. I know it doesn't feel like what you do with family, but a simple letter confirming the amount and purpose of any significant gift or loan protects everyone. It protects you if the relationship changes. It protects the person receiving it if there's ever any confusion later. The business loan memo I wrote on a wire transfer out of habit turned out to be more important than any paperwork I thought to create at the time. I learned that. And if you are watching someone being pushed out slowly, a parent being kept at arm's length, a grandparent being handed a list of terms just to sit in a room with their grandchild, say something. Not to start a fight, not to escalate, but say something, because the person being isolated is often the last one to see it clearly. They're too busy trying to follow the rules. Last week, Lily lost her first tooth. It happened at my house on a Saturday afternoon while she was eating an apple and I was doing dishes. She came running into the kitchen holding the tooth in her palm like it was a coin she'd found on the ground, absolutely beside herself. I got down to her level and looked at the gap in her smile, and she was so proud she was practically vibrating. I took a photo of her right there in my kitchen, standing in her socks on the linoleum, gap-toothed and grinning, dandelion stained from the yard. I sent the photo to Sophie, and I kept one for myself, and I put a copy in the small frame on my kitchen counter, next to the picture of Carol in the rocking chair with Lily asleep against her chest. Carol would have called everybody she knew about that tooth. She would have made it an event. She would have baked something to celebrate the occasion of a single lost tooth, because that was exactly the kind of person she was. I like to think she saw it happen. I like to think she was right there in that kitchen with us, just a little off to the side, smiling at the both of us the way she always did, like she couldn't quite believe how lucky we all were. I've thought a lot about what actually caused all of this. Not in a bitter way. I'm past bitter. But in the way you think about a bridge that failed and you want to understand exactly which joint gave out first so it never happens again, Brandon didn't wake up one morning and decide to become the kind of man who invoices a grandfather for access to a 6-year-old. That kind of thing builds slowly. It builds when small manipulations go unchallenged. It builds when the people around you keep the peace a little too quietly for a little too long. I kept the peace for almost 2 years. I drove 45 minutes each way, parked on the street, followed every rule, swallowed every instinct I had. I told myself I was being respectful of their household. What I was actually doing was teaching Brandon that there was no floor to what I'd accept. Every time I nodded and complied, I confirmed for him that the next ask was probably also fine. That's not his fault alone. That's on me. What I know now is that patience without a limit isn't a virtue. It's an invitation. The thing that finally moved me wasn't anger. Anger had come and gone in those first few days after I read that PDF sitting at my kitchen table. What moved me was something quieter and steadier than anger. It was the understanding that what was being done to me had a shape, that it had been done to other people, that it had a name, and that I had legal standing to address it. That understanding came from one phone call to Ruth, who'd been through something similar and knew a name. James Whitfield. One phone call was all it took to stop absorbing and start thinking clearly. Tracing the truth of the $11,000 wasn't something I did out of revenge. I want to be honest about that. I did it because I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with, and what Gerald showed me told me everything. When a person moves $8,300 into a private account 18 days after receiving a family gift, while simultaneously building a case for why you should pay a monthly fee to see your own grandchild, that person has told you exactly who they are. I wasn't reading between the lines. The lines were right there in black and white on a bank statement. Sophie didn't know. I was right about that. And the moment she stood in that doorway and said, "What account?" that was the moment everything shifted. Not because I'd engineered it, because the truth was always going to come out the moment someone actually looked. I just made sure there was documentation when it did. What I want to say, if any of this sounds like your life right now, is that your clearest tool is not confrontation. It's not anger. It's not going to the person causing harm and letting them know exactly how you feel. Your clearest tool is documentation, patience, and one good professional in your corner who knows the law and doesn't get loud. James never raised his voice. Gerald just pulled files. That's all it took. The other thing I want to say is this. What you give to family should come from love, and it usually does. But love doesn't mean careless. A simple record of what you gave, when, and why. Not because you don't trust them, but because clarity protects everyone. That one habit would have saved me a great deal. I wrote business loan on a wire transfer out of nothing more than habit, and that habit turned out to matter more than I knew at the time. Lily still calls herons standing birds. I still fill Carol's bird feeder every few days. Last Saturday, Lily helped me fill it. She was very serious about it, measuring the seed with a little plastic scoop like it was a laboratory experiment. Carol would have taken 17 pictures. Some things cost what they cost. What I got back was worth every bit of it.